Great. I'm going to introduce you to our first presenter for this session, Sreedhar and Shanthi Ameratunga from Te Whatu Ora, Health New Zealand. They're going to be speaking to us about health and wellbeing of disabled Asian youth in Aotearoa New Zealand. So a round of applause as they come up on stage, please.
Ko ahumairangi te maunga, ko raukoa te moana, no whanganuia tara ahau, ko uma toku ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's an immense pleasure to be standing up here talking to an audience at one of the most engaged, inspiring conferences I've ever been to. My name is Uma. I'm a junior doctor at Te Whatu Ora Waitemata, and I'm really excited to be presenting some mahi that I've been working on with a fantastic group of researchers. This is Thriving at Crossroads, and our kaupapa for this presentation is the health and well-being of disabled Asian youth in Aotearoa New Zealand. So just before we begin, as Ruben already mentioned, the content of this presentation will have mentions of some topics that might be triggering for some individuals. We will be covering topics like suicide, suicidal thoughts, depression, and long-term or chronic illness. So if anyone is distressed by that, please do what you need to do, engage in self-care and seek help as you need it. So let's start with a story. This is Ali's story. Ali was an engaging and happy child. She was the youngest child of a family of South Asian immigrants living in a predominantly Pākehā town in Aotearoa, New Zealand. At preschool age, Ali was diagnosed with severe short-sightedness and astigmatism. With these two conditions, she found it incredibly difficult to keep up with her peers, to engage with her social networks, and to feel included and part of her community. At the age of 8, Ali was diagnosed with cancer, and as part of that cancer treatment, she required chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation therapy to her face that significantly changed her appearance. Some of the long-term consequences of that treatment were asymmetric growth of her face, cataracts, and long-term compromised immunity. Now, growing up as a minority ethnicity in a predominantly Pākehā town was already quite difficult for Ali. But after her treatment, and with a very visible disability, she found that she was even more excluded from her peer groups. She was bullied and harassed. She often felt she was treated unfairly by her teachers, by the people around her. She didn't feel she was able to ask for help from her family, although they would have supported her had they known. Now, fast forward to high school age, none of these issues had really resolved. In fact, Ali was experiencing more and more mental distress. She was feeling more excluded than ever. And this progressed to anxiety and depression and to suicidal ideation. Now, Ali was fortunate. She was able to access counselling services that made an impact for her, and she was able to deal with the mental distress that she was experiencing. However, the trauma that she experienced in those formative years of her life did not go away. Now, the question we have to ask is, this experience of an Asian young person living with a disability in Aotearoa New Zealand, how unique is that story? So to our research. Previous research has drawn attention to the health of Māori, Pacific, and other minoritized young people in Aotearoa. The experiences of Asian young people in Aotearoa in general tend to experience more adverse effects, such as barriers to accessing healthcare, increased discrimination, and increased levels of psychological distress. We also know that there's limited policy relevant and data available for disabled young people in Aotearoa. Now, we can extend that further to say that there's limited policy relevant data and limited policy for the health and well-being of Asian young people in Aotearoa living with a disability. So the question is, does the experience of disabled Asian young people differ from either one of those above identities? And if so, how? The aims of this kaupapa were to establish what evidence already exists about disabled Asian young people in Aotearoa. Secondly, we wanted to analyse the Youth 19 survey data. Now, Youth 19 was a cross-sectional survey of secondary school students in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So we wanted to use that data to examine the patterns of health and well-being for disabled young people in Aotearoa, and specifically for disabled Asian young people. And we also wanted to consider the implications of this data using an intersectionality lens. So the first aim, a scoping review, as you can see, the large rectangle is New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand. Now, the scoping review data that we were looking at is situated quite neatly in between those three intersecting circles. We've got Asian, disability or chronic condition, and we've got youth. So this is the question. And what we can see is we did a scoping review, searched the databases for current literature, and we identified the relevant literature through a screening process. And our findings were that most commonly, access or barriers to healthcare and support systems were the things being reported on. There were also reports on specific health conditions. There was a mixture of the kind of evidence that was available. And in general, evidence tended to report on Asian as a broad, homogenous group. That's to say, they reported on all Asian as one group, without specifically separating out those different communities. So our first set of recommendations from this mahi. So Asian is a diverse group. I think in this room we all know that. It's a diverse group with varying cultural and health needs within it. So we need research, we need data, we need policy that can make these clearer and that can make these more specific to the different communities within it. Secondly, access to healthcare and educational support services are an area of concern for both disabled Asian youth and for their families. So we need to improve our healthcare and education systems to be more accessible and to be more responsive to those disabled Asian youth. Now on to our second aim. So this was using Youth 19 survey data, which is a fantastic series of cross-sectional surveys done of secondary school students in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Now, it was a broad range of responses and a very robust sampling method. And from the Youth 19 survey done in 2019, we can see that 324 individuals identified as both disabled and Asian. And then we've also got non-disabled Asian youth, 1,452, disabled Pākehā youth, 770, and non-disabled Pākehā youth, 2,300. So now this looks like a lot of data, but I'm going to break it down for you. So this is how are we presenting the data. You can see the blue bar there is disabled Asian youth, and I've added some arrows there. So what we can see is the first two measures, safety in community and safe at home. Disabled Asian youth report that they feel safe in the community and safe at home in a similar prevalence level to their peers. That's to say that there wasn't a significant difference between any of the groups. Now, when we go across to safe in school, the third columns, we can see that there starts to be a difference emerging. We can see that disabled Asian youth in general feel less safe at school compared to non-disabled Asian youth and compared to non-disabled Pākehā youth. Interestingly, we see that disabled Pākehā youth also feel less safe at school. And finally, feeling included in school. Now, disabled Asian youth feel included in school more so than disabled Pākehā youth, although it's not a significant difference. Now, this is possibly one of the most profound findings from our study. What we can see is the well-being outcomes for the youth surveyed. Now, if you look at disabled Asian youth in the first column, depressive symptoms, we can see that actually disabled Asian youth experience significantly more depressive symptoms compared to all of their peers in these included groups. Disabled Pākehā youth also experience increased prevalence of depressive symptoms, but it's still less than disabled Asian youth. If we go across to the next column, we can see that for suicidal thoughts, disabled Asian youth experience a lot more, significantly more, compared to their non-disabled Asian peers. Disabled Pākehā youth also experience significantly more suicide thoughts compared to their non-disabled Pākehā peers. And finally, reporting good well-being. We can see that for both disabled Pākehā and disabled Asian youth, they have significantly lower reports of good well-being compared to their non-disabled peers. There's quite a disparity, I'm sure you'll agree. Finally, we looked at healthcare interaction. So the first set of columns, foregone healthcare, is basically asking participants whether in the last 12 months they've felt there's been any time they wanted or needed to see a doctor and about their health, but they weren't able to. Now, as you can see, disabled Asian youth experience significantly more foregone healthcare compared to their non-disabled Asian peers. Disabled Pākehā youth also experience more foregone healthcare, but it's significantly less than disabled Asian youth. And finally, for healthcare discrimination. For healthcare discrimination, we use the question, have you ever been treated unfairly by a health professional because of your ethnicity or ethnic group? Now, as you can see again, disabled Asian youth have the highest prevalence reporting of that. So to our second set of recommendations. It can sound very doom and gloom. It's important to note that there are also some positive findings that emerge from these studies. So firstly, positive outcomes are that disabled Asian youth feel that they are safe in their community and they feel included in school. They also feel safe at home. Those are important findings in terms of their community engagement and in terms of their engagement with their families. To the second point, policy opportunities are crucial to be aware of when we're looking at this data. With the new establishment of Whaikaha, Ministry for Disabled People, and the Ministry for Ethnic Communities, there is a better opportunity than ever to make a difference for the health and well-being of these groups. That's not to say that existing organisations such as Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand and the Ministry of Education, they should also be doing their part to ensure that there are safe spaces for these individuals and that their health and well-being, community and school engagement are all looked after. Mental health and well-being have clearly been identified as priority areas and they should be urgently addressed. I'll hand over to my co-presenter Shanthi now.
Thank you, Uma. I whanau mai aho ki Sri Lanka, I tupua ke aho ki Porirua, e no hanai nai nei aho e Tāmaki Makaurau, ko Shanthi, Ameratunga, tōku ingoa. So greetings everybody, it's lovely to be at this conference. The first time I'm involved. I've been working in the youth health field for a while. I'm a pediatrician and a public health physician, working in epidemiology, which is a bit of a number geek thing. I've been very inspired by the work that I'm hearing and the ways in which you're engaging, so it's just amazing. My agenda here, I might just need your, my agenda here is to actually talk a little bit about something that I think has come up in many presentations right from the first day, and I think it's about what we mean by intersectionality, a bit of a big word. It's a term that was coined by a black feminist lawyer in the 1980s, 1990s. This is Kimberly Crenshaw, and she basically was pushing back against the anti-discrimination laws in the US, not because she was against anti-discrimination, but she found they were wanting in terms of taking a very monocular view on one thing at a time. So the feminists were talking about gender rights. The anti-racists were talking about anti-racist stuff. But she pointed out something that had been known for decades, actually going back to the previous century, the 19th century, which was effectively saying actually being, for example, black and female was a whole different experience in terms of the potency or the strength with which people get excluded than being either one of those identities alone. And this plays out over and over again in the work we do. It's not that any one of these axes of differences are not problematic in themselves, but if you're marginalized in more than one, the whole is much more than the sum of the parts. So if we looked at the data from Youth 19, but this time looking at Asian and other ethnic minorities, that's including Middle Eastern, Latin American, and African communities all joined into one, which is a bit of a problem because they obviously have quite different experiences. But just for now, take that group as a whole and compare them to the young European high school students. Being treated fairly by teachers was much less likely if you were in an Asian or ethnic minority group. Significant depressive symptoms, much more common. Good overall health looked like it was relatively similar. But add a few other social identities, and things begin to look considerably more challenging and worrying. So if you happen to be also disabled or having a questioning or sexual gender minority group as one of your identities, or seen as a person of color, seen as an Asian or ethnic minority person, or Pacific or Maori, basically looking darker in color, you were much more likely to basically be treated unfairly than just being Asian ethnic per se. Similarly, for depressive symptoms, these particular intersectional identities made things a lot worse. You can see for good overall health, while things looked okay in an overall sense, it was a very different story when you add to the mixture being disabled or having a sexual or gender minority status or being female. So what's the issue here? Is it about just having different identities? I don't think there's anyone in this room who's the same as anyone else. We would look like a group of pretty scary robots if we were. We are all different, and thank heavens for that. What is the real problem here is that there are ways in which our society is structured, our institutions are structured, the people around us are behaving that effectively make our experience of some of these identities problematic. Not because we are the problem, but it's made to be a problem. So that's where power and privilege effectively make some people, by dint of their identities, basically being the colonizers as opposed to the colonized, or being white relative to a person of color, being male, maybe. I'm not applying this to all males or all people of color, it varies. But these are ways in which things can suddenly look different because marginalized identities begin to interlock because of the systems that we're living in society that we're in, the social norms, the ways in which beauty is conceived, the ways in which your worth is considered. This is a fundamental interest of the interest that people who take an intersectional lens take. It's not just your identities, it's how you're made to feel and what opportunities you're effectively deprived of. The other fundamental aspect of intersectionality is it is effectively a form of activism. It demands action. It's not good enough to explain these things. Epidemiologists you might have seen from COVID, we are very, very good with charts and graphs and numbers. This is not about that. This is about being compelled to act, because once you see some of this, you can't unsee it. And it effectively has to make you want to see change towards social justice or address the injustices. And that actually, I think, I've just shamelessly borrowed your logo. I think that's what this conference is all about. That's what you are all about. So the final set of recommendations is effectively saying we particularly need to acknowledge what taking a decolonized approach means. It's not necessarily the voice of the privileged, the questions that are coming from certain types of people. What are the wider implications that we need to consider if we want to address inequities and all the isms in their ugly forms combined together? Racism, sexism, ableism, colonialism, yeah, the list goes on. The other thing is that we really need to properly consider what engaging with young disabled people, Maori, Pacifica, ethnic youth, people from LGBT communities, all other stripes and shapes and forms, effectively what is how are their aspirations effectively considered, and how can they basically effectively run the agenda. There is a very well-known statement that people in the disability community use, nothing about us without us. This applies particularly in this context. And I think it's we can talk of co-design, we can talk of participation, and the reality in the end is how do we genuinely make people feel engaged. So I want to end with just reminding ourselves of Ellie's story that Uma began with. Why did that young woman, young girl, have to feel so lonely, so different, so excluded, so silenced? She didn't have to feel like that. Who is really, and I'm using a deficit term here, blind? It is us who don't see that story, even sometimes in our policies and our disability agendas. So I think there's a clear need for us to take off our lenses, maybe put on some intersectional lenses, and be in the journey together. So thank you for the opportunity. I think you're all doing amazing, Mahi. We need to join forces and work towards a better world. Kia ora koutou.
Ngā mihi, Uma and Shanthi. Thank you very much for taking this time to share. Don't run away from me. No, here we go. Still a koha for you. I know that we all would love to hear for a lot longer than the 20 minutes we have available to us today. Great, so moving straight on, our next presenter is Rodrigo Ramalho. I've been told we can call him Rama, from the School of Population Health, the University of Auckland, and he's speaking to us about living under the shadow, public discourse on intersectional ethnic minority youth in the news and media. Round of applause, paki paki for Rodrigo.
Thank you. I will say this afterwards, but just first of all, thank you very much to Involve for the opportunity to share our research with you guys. Thank you for being here today. I've been told I have this voice that can put you to sleep. I'm going to try my best not to succeed in that regard, but I also want to acknowledge Uma and Shanthi for the presentation. That presentation was from a larger study that is called Thriving at Crossroads. And I have the link to that larger study. And that was phase 1 of the study. We were trying to have a look through secondary data, looking at census, at what was sort of the situation of the target population, which was ethnic minority youth with intersectional identities. What I'm going to share with you now is the findings from the second phase of this larger study, which is Thriving at Crossroads. And for this study, we did a critical discourse analysis of the discourse used in mainstream news media when referring to or talking about ethnic minority youth with intersectional identity. But first of all, I thought it was probably useful to talk about what is discourse. And we can define discourse as language in action or language in use. But I think potentially a more enlightening way of thinking about it is to think about discourse as language in context. And context is basically the information that you need to make sense of the text, which not necessarily is something written, it could be something said to you as well. So imagine, for example, that someone says, "Can you pass me the thing that is on top of the thing?" If someone else listens to that statement, that other person might not be able to make sense of what you're trying to say. But if you are with someone and you're both working on this thing and you both know the steps that you need to go through to do this thing, and you are familiar with what is coming next and the thing that this person might need to do that thing that is coming next, you might be familiar then with what is the thing that is going to be needed. Plus, you also know where you are keeping things, so you know that that thing is probably stored over there and very likely stored on top of the other thing. So for you, that you are inside that context, the discourse, "Can you pass me the thing on top of the thing?" that makes perfect sense. So discourse is something that draws meaning from the context. It, in a way, reflects reality, and you need to be within that context and have this set of shared meanings to make sense of the discourse. But discourse can also create reality. So imagine, for example, movie reviews, and sometimes you might have already an idea of what the movie is like without even having watched it. And you will know that it's a bad or a good movie, or this happened there, they left that there even though it was unscripted. Or you might have never been to South America, but you have watched movies, you have watched TV series, you have heard from people that have visited South America, so you have a very good idea of what South America feels like, smells like, looks like, etc., because discourse have that capacity as well. In a sort of feedback loop, it doesn't only draw meaning from the context and from reality, but it can also, in a sort of feedback loop, it can create reality itself. So what is discourse analysis then? Discourse analysis is a way of looking at that discourse and trying to make sense of how the meanings that are realized in that discourse, how are those meanings being realized in that discourse? How is what being said realizing those meanings, and how those meanings are related to the context, to the social or to the cultural context. And the other thing that you're also trying to make sense of is how is this discourse contributing to either reproduce, perpetuate, validate, or potentially even challenge the reality that it is creating, reflecting in a sort of feedback loop. And if you're doing a critical discourse analysis, what you're paying again an extra attention to the potential role of power imbalances or inequities that might be used in that discourse, or they might be reflected in that discourse. So, in our study, we looked at mainstream news media in New Zealand, and we were paying attention to the discourse, to what was being said about ethnic minority youth with intersectional identity. And we were paying particular attention to these dimensions. How was their identity as New Zealanders being discussed, their identity as ethnic minorities, and issues of health and well-being. We tried to make sure that we included as much as was necessary, and we used this news text search engine that drives you to news articles. And our first run, we came to the quick realization that if we wanted to have a look at everything that was published forever, since there was record of this news, we would be looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of articles. So we were strategic about it, and we decided instead to focus on this one period of time, these 6 months, the second half of the first year of the pandemic. And the rationale behind that was that there was a lot of events of discrimination and racism that were being reported in the news media, so we thought, okay, this is probably a good time to catch. If there were to be any sort of those events being reported in the news media, they might potentially be showing up at this stage. And we tried to cover as many newspapers or many news wires as we could. But keep in mind that these are all mainly mainstream media, so we didn't include any ethnic media. And we wanted, when putting in our search words, we wanted to include as many as there were necessary to make sure that any article that had any word about youth or any word about ethnicity would be picked up by the search engine. And we realized that it would not make sense to double the work, because if we were to include the intersectional identities, the additionally minoritized identities in the search, basically we were unnecessarily doubling the work. So if a news was about an ethnic minority youth with an X additional identity, then it would have been picked up anyway because of these keywords. So we didn't need to add any additional keywords to capture this news. A lot came up anyway, but at this stage it was okay, self-harm. We did that to ourselves. We now just have to go through it. And that's what we did. We went through these over 4,000 articles. We read them, each one of them, And at the end, we ended up with about 39 articles that were centered on ethnic minority youth, or someone who was now an adult, but was talking about their youth. So the article was itself centered around their youth, and we decided to include those as well. And even with that, the number was still very small, which is itself very telling, I would say. So what did we find? We were trying to find the discourse used in this news, and we found that there was a sort of template. All 39 articles were either about success stories, or there were, and I'm going to talk about each one of them, discussions about a modern and inclusive Aotearoa, or there were stories about people standing up against racism. So the first group of studies, and this was the vast majority of the articles, these were descriptions of people who were either from New Zealand or from outside of New Zealand, but they were ethnic, and they had a sort of rough start, but through hard work and dedication, they managed to achieve their goals. So that was the highlight of the article. And the goals varied. It could be someone wanting to finish their studies, getting a job, or ending up in the Ivy League, whichever goals they were. And the other type of stories that were included in this group were about people who, having made it, were now focused on giving back to their communities. For example, being role models for other members of their community. Like I said, these were the vast majority of the articles. There were also other articles that were mainly from people who were looking back at their youth, and they were telling stories about how when they were young, they didn't have a very good time because they were either bullied or they had a rough time at school because people would make fun of their meals or things like that. So these were stories where there was a recollection of some experiences of events of the racism and discriminations, but these events were situated in the past. Or at times they were situated in smaller towns across the country. But basically they were telling the stories that how now that time has passed or that they have moved, they were living in a place and a time where they could embrace their culture and their differences. But there were just, and these were the minority, articles about current or present events of racism and discriminations. But when these type of articles came up, they often didn't focus on those events, but more on trying to paint a sort of objective perspective of everything that happened. So they were also telling the other side of the story. For example, there was this potential skit that was deemed as racist by some members of the community, and they were interviewing members of the school, and they were interviewing other members of their community who were telling the other side of the story, saying things like, for example, oh, it was just a joke, it wasn't really that bad. Or a story about someone who was called things in the bus, but the article focused on the fact that this young Kiwi girl stood up and defended the man who was being bullied in the bus. So there were current events of racism, but they overall were focused on making sure that the other side of the story was also told. So basically, if you are reading these newspapers, you have this picture of New Zealand. You are drawing, as a writer, you're making sure that the reader is going to be able to share with you from your shared set of meanings to make sense of the context. And you're also making sure, and what is also happening is the discourse that you're using is also sort of creating reality itself. So by means of that, you have the salience of these success stories and stories of people who, having made it, are now focusing on giving back to their community. They create this normative discourse, this ideal of how ethnic minority young people are like. They create this sense of role models. These are the people that made it. These are the people that were able to succeed. And they did so because they put in the hard work and the dedication that is necessary to do that. And the other thing is they are helping to perpetuate or validate the idea that Aotearoa is a place that provides opportunities for those who will put in the hard work and dedication that is necessary to succeed. Of course, if you put the hard work, then you are going to make it. So that is basically the picture that you end up with when looking at newspapers. You are confirmed in your belief that New Zealand is a country that provides opportunities to everybody, and you are confirmed in your beliefs that ethnic minority youth are succeeding in this country. Of course, if they put in the hard work, and these are the role models. So this is the reality that you end up with by reading news, which is a good thing overall, or it might look like a good thing. There are no bad stories here, and they're painting a good picture of ethnic minority young people. Interestingly, and this is something to highlight, the intersectionality of it all was not so much mentioned in this article. So if you are, as a reader, thinking about ethnic minority youth, the idea that you have in your mind about ethnic minority youth is unlikely to include any intersectional identities within it. You are unlikely to see ethnic minority youth beyond their ethnicity. And this was sort of confirmed in some of the findings that we have from later phases of our study, that very often when people look at ethnic minority youth, that is the first thing that they're going to see if they don't belong to those communities. Now, the thing is that these stories, they cast a big shadow. And what remains hidden under these stories is the fact that there is a system of discrimination and oppression that has been harming and continues to harm not only our ethnic communities, but also our indigenous communities. We know, you have seen the data showing it, we know that ethnic minority youth don't only have success stories. They are going through a hard time. They are facing challenges. They are facing struggles. But these are not reflected in our shared understanding of what ethnic minority youth is going through. So basically, this remains unseen. And the idea that is perpetuated is one of a system as a whole that is continuously providing opportunities and possibilities for people who are going to put in the hard work. And is continuing providing ethnic minority, ethnic communities, and the general population with these role models, this ideal of how ethnic minority youth should look like or act like. So, unfortunately, the other result of this is that if you are a member of an ethnic minority community, you're a young person, and you want to voice your struggles, you want to voice your concerns, you're going to be easily put down. Because we all know that if you were to put in the hard work, if you were to put in the dedication, you would make it. So your struggle, your challenges, your concerns are sort of illegitimated through that fact. Because we all know that that is not really the case. What you're saying, and I know because I have read this news that people have made, that you are potentially perhaps not putting in the hard work as everybody, as role models are doing it. So, to summarize it all, through these stories that news media are sharing about ethnic minority youth, they are sort of being used to perpetuate or validate these myths around Aotearoa as a country that has an inbuilt system that continuously provide opportunities to those who put in the hard work. And we know that there are members of ethnic minority groups that are using these opportunities, and they're putting in the hard work and dedication that is needed to succeed. So it creates this normative discourse, these role models. But under the shadow of these stories, the lived experience of ethnic minority youth, especially those with intersectional identities, remains hidden, and the whole system remains hidden. And unfortunately, that might lead to people don't feeling that their concerns or struggles or challenges are legitimate. They could make it a thing of their own. It is my own fault. I am failing as an individual because there are opportunities here, there are examples of people who are doing it. So what is happening? I am the problem. I am the one that is not making what is necessary to succeed. And this is only if we're focusing on ethnicity, but if we take into account, as was brought up by Shanthi and Uma, issues of intersectional identity, then the thing gets even worse. So I saw that Uma and Shanthi had a slide about recommendations, but I don't have one. But perhaps we could make that the first question of the Q&A coming up, so I can have time to think about it as well. But I do want to say again, thank you very much to Involve for giving us the opportunity to share our research. I also want to acknowledge Health Research Council for providing the funding that was necessary to do the research, and of course, the whole team of Thriving at Crossroads, a fantastic team that I have learned so much with them. So yeah, thank you very much.
Ngā mihi Rama, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. Everyone walks away from me. Koha. There you go. Thank you. Sweet. Oh, look at that. He's got 1 minute and 17 left as well. Perfect timing. Who wants to volunteer to ask that first question? We've already got that locked in. We've got that scheduled so someone can ask that question when we get to our Q&A. Sweet. I'm going to move on to our third presenter. We're doing really well on time. Flora Apulu from Unitec. She's going to speak to us about moving towards restoring the sacredness and central place of young Samoan women in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So round of applause, paki paki, as she makes it up onto stage.
Wow. Talo falava, soifua manawea, e momo lava na whawhetaima vi ia le tua, soifua. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to my presentation on towards restoring the sacredness and central place of young women, young Samoan women in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Today I would like to share with you some of my findings from my master's research titled Tamaitai Samoa, an autoethnographic analysis of cultural principles that contribute to the well-being of Samoan young women in New Zealand. The purpose of my study was to define and analyze the historical and contemporary literature on the cultural principles of Sa, Moa, and Whatu, and then demonstrate how these principles may contribute to the well-being of Samoan young women, again, in Aotearoa. I had two main research questions, and those were, how are Sa, Moa, and Whatu defined in historical and contemporary literature, and how do Sa, Moa, and Whatu contribute to the well-being, again, of Tamaitai? Today, due to time, I will focus on just sharing with you some of my findings on the two cultural principles of Sa and Moa. My research that I carried out with my master's is actually dedicated to my grandmother, Folototo, Malilenga Folototo, and I dedicated it to my Heavenly Father as well, and I really wanted to showcase her story through my research and some of the life lessons that she shared with me while I was growing up. So Folo, my great-grandmother, was one of my main caregivers growing up. She, alongside my mother, revealed to me these ancient values of Sa and Moa, and they gave me the opportunity to learn under them as a Tamaitai. My great-grandmother passed away in 2007, and I wanted to again write about her life and share her pioneering story as a Tamaitai. Often when you get into research, it's trying to make a big contribution to the world, but for me, it was a bit more personal. I wanted to do this for my great-grandmother and for my ainga. So when I got first class honours, I'll just put that in there. Oh, thank you. That helped me relieve some nerves. I felt that, I felt very proud that her story, as well as her life lessons she taught me, was honoured in that way as well. And more so, for those of you who are thinking about getting into research, that research will always be there for future generations to find. Not long after my great-grandmother passed away, I decided to go and study a Bachelor of Social Work and complete some postgraduate studies. So I wanted to share with you just a little bit about my background and research position. So I present my story and my study from the perspective of a tamaitai, a daughter, a sister, a fiancé who was born and raised in Aotearoa, New Zealand by my parents and grandparents. As a youth worker, starting from the age of 12 with my first youth council in Manurewa, and going on to become a registered social work practitioner. I think I've been in the field, I calculated this the other day, I think just over 17 years. More so now, I've specialised more in youth development and Pacific research. I've worked with vulnerable young people, at-risk, in-risk youth offenders and their families, and tried my best to advocate for them on a national and a more so regional level. I've helped to train and manage social workers, youth workers, counsellors, and throughout the years, just really developed or tried to develop an appreciation of this whole field of research, and more so the importance of your culture and who you are. I guess this desire to serve stems from my faith, my values, my beliefs, and the cultural principles that have been instilled into me. Before delving into the two cultural principles, I thought it would be useful for me just to share with you a little bit of background about the Samoan culture. So the Samoan way, or Wha'asamoa, is an ancient culture over 3,000 years old. It is of divine origin and gifted by God. Samoans, they don't believe that they migrated from anywhere to get to Samoa. They believe that they actually were originated in Manua, which is one of the islands in Samoa. Samoan culture is complex, like a fish with many bones. Its aspects are often camouflaged, hidden at times, and can be taken for granted of and taken advantage of by people. In saying that, part of my research took a lot of intentional searching, intentional seeking, trying to make sense of these ancient principles that often can sometimes get twisted along the way, as many values and principles do. But in saying that, this research, again, helped to bring it back to the essence of what these cultures, or what these principles actually mean. Samoa culture is based on a social structure called the wha'amatai, or the matai system. Thank you. I thought it would also be useful just to share with you an idea of what well-being looks like for Samoan people. So Samoans view well-being as holistic. So it's made up of 3 different key parts, similar to Te Whare Tapawha, which is made up of the body, the mind, and the soul. In order to get well-being as a Samoan, these different aspects of a Samoan need to be in balance. And often, as we all know as youth workers or practitioners, it's a very hard place to get to. But I guess as long as we're striving towards that, then that'll help us. Okay, now to the more body of my research. So, in search of Sa, or sacredness. So the search of Sa stems from my curiosity and fascination with this notion of Tamaitai being sacred. So ever since my great-grandmother and my mother told me about it, as a young woman growing up, I was like, what does that even mean? And now as an older person, I guess when you go through challenges in life, you start to look for the wisdom around you. Oh, what did my mum say? Or what did my great-grandmother say? So I'm glad now down the road I've had this opportunity to go back and have a look at some of these principles. In terms of my research, I had to start at a place that I was familiar with, or at least try to be familiar with, and that was the Mesopotamian stories of creation, where it says in Genesis 1:27 that God created male and female in his image, and in the image of God he created them. In a broader sense, this meant to me that from the beginning of time, each individual is born with the divinity or sacredness of Christ himself. This notion then connected with my foundational knowledge of cultural principles of Sa and Moa, and why I've been interested in searching for the meaning and relevance of the sacredness of human beings. This search for Sa led me to ask many questions such as, how can individuals be born with this intrinsic value of God when they account for most of the evil and suffering in the world? Other questions arose too. What would the world be like if we treated ourselves and others if they were made in the image of God? Or if we treated others as transcendent beings? Could you imagine a world like that? Could you imagine where you treated yourself like you mattered? Hopefully that meant if you could see the sacredness within yourself, then you could then move on to seeing the sacredness in others. Furthermore, how would treating Tamaitai or Samoan young women as transcendent and sacred, made in the image of God, be a solution to many of the challenges that they face? I won't get into the challenges because you as youth workers and practitioners already know them. If we treated Tamaitai in this way, as if they were sacred, would that be an antidote to some of the issues and some of the malevolence that exist in the world? And if it was, then maybe it's something we ought to do. In saying all of this, I believe that the ancient Samoans understood this concept, and that's why they created this concept and cultural principle of Sa, which exists within the Samoan culture. You see, traditionally, Samoan young women and Tamaitai were the repositories of their ainga and family's mana. And not only their family, but their anganu'u or their village as well. So mana is a generative force and energy known as the power of the gods in the human world. It is really closely connected to the belief around most Polynesian religious beliefs and practices, being that they are focused on ritual transformation. So traditionally, to encounter Tamaitai was to encounter the supernatural, or even the divine. However, it's also important to note that to maintain the status of Sa did not come without its boundaries, as well as sacrifices. One of those sacrifices was that Te Maitai had to control their loto, which could mean that their desires or natural impulses. So it wasn't without its challenges, as well as there were different consequences if that status was not protected or respected, not only for Samoan young women, but those around them, their ainga, their family, or their community or village. In search of more, I'm really glad that this conference theme is to do with navigation in the stars. So the cultural principle of more, which is not often spoken about, but is a manifestation of a center that transforms itself subconsciously, consciously, like a compass, that can orient and reorient, especially in the unknown and more chaotic times in life. As part of my research, I came to realize that it's important that we identify what is at our center, why it is there, and how can we maintain what is at that center if what is found there is necessary for well-being, peace, and harmony. There's a quote by one of my favorite authors, Iliad, that goes, "Every microcosm, every inhabited region has what may be called a center, which is a place that is sacred above all." Throughout my research, I found that the cultural principles of Sa and Moa really complement each other and support each other. This notion that Te Maitai hold and transmit the sacred power of mana is really key to understanding their sacredness and the reason why they're involved at the center of many key rituals. Their rituals, ceremonies, customs, as well as why Te Maitai hold different sacred roles, such as being the healer, the teacher, the priestess, the maker of wealth, and the peacemaker. A great symbolic representation of the mana that is given to Te Maitai by God is central to this work of art, beautiful work of art, featured in the Muliwai Cathedral in Apia, Samoa. Anyone been there? So as seen here, the Te Maitai, who is sitting at the center of the sacred circle of the whānau of chiefs, she is sitting directly under the Holy Mother, so here, and Christ himself. And I believe that Te Maitai is sitting at the center of the whānau whale because she represents the central ideal whereby she is the manifestation and connection between heaven and earth. I liken this representation to the ancient ideas around the Axis Mundi, Jacob's ladder, or even the tree of life, whereby the center is the spiritual connection that descends between heaven and earth. You can also see here that the Te Maitai sits poised and behind the ava bowl, that's an ava bowl, to perform the ava ceremony, so that the sacred power or mana given to her from the divine then flows through her, which she prepares. So when she prepares the ava for the chiefs, she is then transferring that sacredness of the divine into the ceremony. So that's an example of Te Maitai as Sa and using their sacredness to help ensure that such rituals and customs are carried out appropriately, thus ensuring peace and harmony. Towards claiming and reclaiming my sacredness and center, Throughout my research, I have been able to articulate how the cultural principles of Sa and Moa have contributed to my well-being. In particular, I remember the time when I was 13 years old and I had to prepare the ava ceremony for my father's sauwhai, which is the bestowing of a chief title in Whaleasi'u in Samoa. I wrote in my research how when I sat down in the whono whale, I took a deep breath and remembered my great-grandmother's words who had trained and prepared me for that moment. Va'ai sao I luma, te patu la'i I luma, awa e te va'ai I lalo, whaasaola olu I lunga, awa e te toi tepa I tua. My great-grandmother's words here continue to guide me on my journey towards claiming and reclaiming my own sacredness and my center. Her words continue to remind me that even though the different parts of life, the difficult parts of life, through the chaos, the challenges, that I must keep moving forward and continue to aim on the greater good. In conclusion, it is my sincere hope that my research will be able to help other tamaita'i understand and realize that they are Sa, sacred, and they are Moa, the center, because of the divine mana that flows through them. I hope that it can help to reinforce the status of tamaita'i, which is that it must be honored, protected, and respected. I hope that tamaita'i, by reading some of the navigation of chaos that I have faced, that they realize that there is still hope, that their mana can always be restored, regardless of what they've been through. Finally, I hope that tamaita'i can go on a journey like I have and am still on, towards restoring and claiming and reclaiming the Sa and Moa within themselves. Whawhetai te le lava.
Ngā mihi, Flora, we really appreciate the kōrero. I'm just going to koha this. Hey, don't run away. Would you like to have a seat on the couch? And could our other presenters please join us as well? We'll have a Q&A session. I heard before we started our first duo of presenters discussing whether they should lie down to do their presentation even. And Rob at the back suggested they do a little bit of a dance for their presentation. Neither of those things happened, but we'll all have a seat on the couch now. Oh, you're all going to squeeze in there? Great, that means I can have this one. Who remembers what our first question was? No one. Rama, do you have any recommendations?
I have been thinking about it. Can you hear me through this? This one. My most honest answer would have to be, I don't know. But perhaps it might help if I share the things that I'm thinking about when coming up with that answer. And it would be easy perhaps to think about the newspapers as the thing that needs to be addressed. People are developing these articles and they're perhaps following an editorial line, and therefore they need to write them in this particular way. However, I'm mindful that the people that are writing these articles, they are themselves employees, they are workers that are working in a specific place, and they are mindful of the need for their productivity. That means basically that they need to produce something that is going to be consumed. So thinking just exclusively about the newspaper is just thinking about half of the equation. The other half of the equation is us as readers, and what are the types of stories that we're clicking in to have a read on. So if there were to be a different type of articles that are not reflecting our already shared understanding of what New Zealand is like and about role models, would people click on those? They might click on articles that they want to hate, as we always do. We read the ones that we kind of like, they're telling us things that are comfortable for us to read, or they're telling us things that we would like to hate. So the other half of the equation, I think, also plays a significant role. We need to strive and seek and read articles that are not just portraying the same story over and over. But perhaps the part that leads me the most to say I don't know is the people that would need to answer this question is young people themselves. We would have to ask young people, what is it that you would like to see reflected in the media? What are the type of news that you think are needed for people to have a more accurate representation of what your experience is like as a young ethnic minority person and someone who has an intersectional identity? But overall, I'm coming back again to my original answer. I don't know.
All good. Hey, we've got about 8 minutes if we have some questions. So feel free to throw a hand up and we'll pass those questions on to our speakers. Yes, down the front here.
And thank you. How people felt about how they were being discriminated against, and I noticed that non-disabled Asian and non-disabled Pākehā both were kind of on an equal level. Do you have any kind of ideas or theories behind why Pākehā might feel targeted for their ethnicity in that area? Because that seems a bit different.
I think that's a really good question. That's something that we remarked upon when we saw the data as well. Unfortunately, because of the way that it was collected in a cross-sectional way, it's difficult to go back and figure out why those participants responded in that way. In terms of theories, I don't think that we didn't really have any particular reason why that might be the case. It could be things like perceiving that you're being treated differently, because I don't know if you remember, but the question was actually specifically asking, did you feel you were treated differently because of your ethnicity? So it could be that they perceived they were treated differently because of their ethnicity, but there might have been some other reason or some other biases that were being acted on. So it is difficult to say, but definitely something that we've looked at as well. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Shanthi.
Just one thing, actually, I forgot to actually put the acknowledgement slide up, and just want to acknowledge this actually in the audience. Professor Terry-Ann Clark is the lead for the Adolescent Health Research Group and Youth to 19, and this is Professor Roshni Pierce-John for the Thriving at Crossroads study. And I think in both these projects, the mahi involved is trying to look at patterns that might reflect where there are some challenges, and especially the youth health surveys which have been done over a period of time, we're seeing some trends, but there's other work that these teams are doing that try to dig deeper, but we are, as Uma's pointed out, kind of limited by accepting at face value what young people responded to and exactly what might be underlying their responses. Probably needs much more in-depth qualitative information. And I think that's in some ways the reality for almost everything we think about in intersectionality as well. It's with data like the ones we've presented, we're looking at almost snapshots, and it's almost like seeing some things like that'll lead to more questions, just like the one you've just raised. But I think underneath it all, and the Thriving at Crossroads study has some really amazing data coming up around qualitative information, which gets to the deeper levels that you've talked about, that kind of reflects so much more of a person's journey and life, both within themselves, but with the sectors we're engaging with. So it's a good question. I'm not sure that we have the exact answer for it.
Rob, would you like me to run around like a madman, or are you happy to? Great. I still believe that no one multitasks better than the production crews, so go hard. Any other questions? Rob will run at you with a microphone.
Can I just mention one thing?
Yeah, please.
Because of the acknowledgement slide wasn't there, if anyone wants more data from Uma and me, my email is probably the easiest, s.ameratunga, as in the last name, @auckland.ac.nz. Please be in touch. We'd love to hear from you and share more information.
Tap her on the shoulder afterwards to get that written down. Questions? Do we have any? Seems like you've just covered everything we needed to know. down here. Oh, yeah. You're behind my lectern. Sorry, my friend. Blind spot.
Would you be, kia ora, ko Oscar toku ingoa. I was just wondering, would you be able to talk to a intersectional approach to climate change? Like, how do we address that through an intersectional lens?
Climate change. And is that like just for all of them?
Or anyone who wants to answer that.
Great.
Who wants to speak? Do you want to speak there? Do you want to speak? I mean, it's a. I'll just start. I think it's a amazingly important question, and I know that there's a session coming up in the panel just after. My take on climate change from an intersectional point of view is just recognizing that we tend to talk very glibly about the global context as a whole, and the reality is it's very different. I mean, in Pacific Islands, the reality is for people in the Pacific Islands right now, some more than others, the reality is very, very different. The risks of displaced people, the risk of, even in the United States, if you happen to be in a low-lying country, if you happen to be poor, if you're in situations where the opportunities you have are different, the impacts are huge. And I think you raise an incredibly important question: where does the risk lie, and whose responsibilities are these to respond to them? Who caused the mess in the first place? What's historically the realities that we are reaping the consequences of, and what are our future generations going to look back and look at us for? So I think we could be having a whole conference on that topic.
Kia ora. I'm going to say, oh, sorry.
But just the little thing that I could add is that, if anything, what intersectionality does is it invites you to pay attention to the various axes that are playing a role in whatever it is that you are studying. So if anything, potentially when looking at climate change and thinking about things that have contributed to it, things that can be done to address it, intersectionality would invite to pay attention to these additional axes. So when presenting with a blanket answer to it, being mindful of the limitation of that blanket answer, and the same when thinking about potential interventions, and if it is presented as a blanket, so this is what we need to do. Who is we in this equation? Different people with different intersection of identities might have different experiences of, or access to resources to do the thing that is required to do, or access to possibilities of doing the things that needs to be done. So if anything, I think it's a great question, because it invites us to think a bit deeper when we're thinking about what has been done, what needs to be done, and those kind of things. So yeah.
Kia ora. A final question, opportunity. Going once. Is that a hand? Is that no? Going twice. Gone. Ngā mihi nui, Rodriguez, Uma, Shanthi, and Flora. Yes. Thank you, ngā mihi nui, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us today.